The frost patterns had grown inward during the night, spreading across the interior cabin wall like frozen lace. Magnus Holt stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching his breath crystallize in the air, and knew that Peter Strand was already dead. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if stories of frontier ingenuity speak to you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story might just change how you see survival itself. The date was February 9th, 1841, and the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero during the night. Magnus had kept the fire burning, feeding split pine into the stone fireplace every 2 hours through the darkness. The cabin interior had never grown warm. When the first gray light filtered through the single oiled paper window, Magnus pulled on his fur mittens and stepped outside into air so cold it burned his lungs. Peter Strand lay 15 feet from the cabin door, curled on his side in the snow. He had gone out some time after midnight to relieve himself. Magnus had heard the door open and close, had heard Peter's boots crunching in the snow, but had fallen back asleep before his partner returned. Except Peter had never returned. He had collapsed in the snow, and the cold had killed him in minutes. Magnus knelt beside the body, already frozen solid, and felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. They had built the cabin together the previous autumn, following the standard method every trapper in the northern Rockies used. Straight pine logs, notched at the corners, stacked and chinked with moss and clay. One door, one window, one fireplace. It had taken them 6 days to complete. The structure kept out wind and snow. That was supposed to be enough. Magnus dragged Peter's body into the cabin and laid him near the fireplace, though there was no point in trying to warm him now. He sat on the split log bench and stared at his partner's frozen face for an hour before he could think clearly enough to make decisions. Peter had been strong, experienced, and careful. He had survived 4 winters in the mountains. He had not frozen because he was weak or foolish. He had frozen because he had gone outside for 3 minutes in extreme cold, wearing inadequate clothing, and his body's heat had drained away faster than he could return to shelter. But that was only the immediate cause. The deeper cause, Magnus realized as he studied the frost patterns coating the interior walls, was that their cabin had never been warm enough. Even with a fire burning constantly, the interior temperature had barely risen above freezing during the coldest nights. The walls were too thin. The chinking was inadequate. The heat from the fireplace escaped faster than it could warm the space. Magnus had heard of trappers freezing to death before. It happened every winter to someone, somewhere in the mountains. Most men accepted it as an unavoidable risk of the life they had chosen. But sitting in that cold cabin with Peter's body growing rigid on the floor, Magnus could not accept it. There had to be a way to build a cabin that held heat better than this. There had to be a method that others had overlooked or never considered. He buried Peter that afternoon in a clearing 200 yards from the cabin, breaking through 18 inches of frozen ground with an axe and shovel. The work took 4 hours and left Magnus exhausted. He piled stones over the grave to keep scavengers away and spoke no words. There was nothing to say that the cold had not already said. Magnus spent the next week alone in the cabin, observing. He fed the fire constantly, keeping flames burning day and night, and measured the results with careful attention. The fireplace consumed an enormous amount of wood. He calculated that he was burning through approximately 70 pounds of split pine every 24 hours. In return, the cabin's interior remained barely tolerable. He could see his breath at all times. Water left in a tin cup overnight developed a skin of ice. The walls sweated condensation that froze into elaborate frost patterns by morning. He began studying those frost patterns with obsessive focus. They appeared primarily on the interior surfaces of the log walls, particularly near the corners where the notched joints created gaps. The frost grew thicker each night, building up in layers that told a story about heat movement. Warm air from the fireplace rose toward the roof, contacted the cold logs, and its moisture immediately froze. The logs themselves were acting as thermal bridges, conducting cold from the exterior directly into the living space. Magnus had learned basic carpentry from his father in Norway, but he had no formal education in building science or engineering. What he possessed was practical experience and the ability to observe patterns. He started paying attention to how heat moved through the cabin. He noticed that the area immediately around the fireplace was reasonably warm, perhaps 50 degrees when the fire burned hot. But 10 feet away, near the walls, the temperature dropped dramatically. The heat was not spreading evenly through the space. It was rising, hitting the roof, and escaping through gaps in the construction. He examined the chinking between logs and found it inadequate. The moss and clay mixture had dried and shrunk, creating cracks that allowed air to pass freely. Cold air entered near the floor, warmed air escaped near the ceiling. The cabin was essentially a chimney with a fire at the bottom. No matter how much wood he burned, he could not overcome the basic structural problem. Other trappers who visited during the following weeks seemed unconcerned by Magnus's observations. They accepted cold cabins as normal. One man, Thomas Wickham, whose camp was 8 miles south, told Magnus that he was thinking too much about problems that had no solutions. Wickham was a veteran of 12 winters in the mountains. He burned massive amounts of firewood, slept in heavy furs, and considered anything more than basic shelter to be unnecessary luxury. Magnus did not argue with him, but he also did not accept Wickham's philosophy. As February gave way to March and the extreme cold moderated, Magnus made a decision. He would not trap the spring season. Instead, he would study buildings, learn everything he could about heat retention, and develop a better method. Peter's death had revealed a problem that most men ignored because acknowledging it required admitting that traditional methods were inadequate. Magnus was willing to admit it. The question was whether he could find a solution that actually worked. Spring came slowly to the mountains in 1841. Snow melted in patches, revealing dead grass and mud beneath. Magnus spent April preparing for a journey to the nearest settlement, a trading post called Fort Benson, located 60 miles east. He needed supplies, but more importantly, he needed to observe how permanent structures were built. Before he left, however, he made a discovery that would change everything. His wood pile stood 30 feet from the cabin, protected by a rough shelter of poles and bark. He had spent the winter splitting pine and stacking it to dry for the following season. The pile was approximately 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 5 feet high. On a morning in late April, Magnus was restacking wood that had shifted during the spring thaw when he noticed something unusual. He had removed several armloads of wood from the exterior of the pile, exposing the interior sections. When he placed his bare hand against the wood in the pile's center, it felt distinctly warmer than the surrounding air. Not warm like fire, but noticeably less cold than the exterior pieces. He pulled more wood away, creating a cavity in the pile's center, and discovered that the temperature difference was significant. The interior wood was perhaps 20 degrees warmer than the air temperature. Magnus sat down in the mud and thought about what this meant. The wood pile was not generating heat. There was no fire, no chemical reaction creating warmth. Yet the center of the pile was warmer than the outside. The only explanation was that the mass of stacked wood was somehow holding heat from the previous summer, releasing it so slowly that it remained detectable even after a full winter. Or perhaps the wood was insulating itself, trapping ambient heat that would otherwise escape. He spent the next 2 days experimenting. He built small test piles using different configurations, wood stacked tightly with no air gaps, wood stacked loosely with significant space between pieces, wood covered with bark versus wood left exposed. He monitored each pile's interior temperature by reaching deep into the stack and gauging warmth with his hand. The results were consistent. Dense piles with minimal air gaps retained more heat than loose piles. Wood covered with insulating material stayed warmer than exposed wood. The insight forming in Magnus's mind was radical. What if cabin walls could be built not from long logs laid horizontally, but from short sections of wood stacked perpendicular to the wall plane? Instead of logs that conducted cold from outside to inside, he could create walls from pieces of wood laid end to end, with insulating material filling the gaps between them. The wood itself would act as thermal mass, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it gradually. The air gaps would prevent direct conduction of cold. Other trappers had massive wood piles. They walked past them daily, restacked them, pulled wood from their centers. But no one had paid attention to the temperature difference Magnus had discovered. It seemed too simple to matter, too obvious to be useful. Magnus knew better. Magnus left for Fort Benson in early May and returned 6 weeks later with supplies that mystified every trapper who saw them. He had purchased 4 crosscut saws of different sizes, 200 pounds of clay powder in cloth sacks, a dozen chisels and augers, 3 levels made of brass and wood, and a massive iron pot for mixing materials. He had spent nearly all the money from his previous year's furs on tools and supplies that had nothing to do with trapping. Thomas Wickham was the first to openly ridicule him. Wickham stopped at Magnus's camp in late June and found him cutting logs into uniform sections. Magnus had felled a straight pine, stripped the bark, and was sawing it into pieces exactly 16 inches long. A pile of perhaps 50 identical sections sat stacked nearby. Wickham watched for several minutes before speaking. "What exactly are you building?" he asked. Magnus explained his theory about thermal mass and stacked wood creating better insulation than horizontal logs. Wickham laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the clearing. He told Magnus that he was wasting an entire trapping season on foolishness, that the old methods worked fine for men tough enough to endure discomfort, that Peter had died from bad luck and stupidity rather than cabin design. Magnus continued sawing and said nothing. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. Men traveling between camps stopped to observe Magnus's peculiar construction project. By August, he had cut nearly 800 sections of wood, all 16 inches long, all approximately 10 inches in diameter. He had rejected dozens of logs as too crooked or irregular. He had spent weeks selecting, felling, and processing timber with obsessive precision. Other trappers called it Holt's folly. They predicted he would starve during the winter because he had trapped no beaver and prepared no pelts for sale. Magnus ignored them. He had begun actual construction in July, starting with a foundation of stones set level on cleared ground. The cabin would be small, just 12 feet by 14 feet, but every element would be precisely measured and carefully executed. He built corner posts from thick logs, sunk 3 feet into the ground, creating a frame that would support the unusual wall construction he envisioned. The walls themselves baffled everyone who saw them taking shape. Magnus laid his 16-inch wood sections perpendicular to the wall plane, ends facing inward and outward, stacked like a horizontal wood pile. Between each piece, he packed a mixture of clay, sawdust, and dried moss that he had spent days preparing. The mixture filled every gap, creating a seal while maintaining insulating air pockets within the wall structure. Each wall was effectively 16 inches thick, more than twice the width of standard log construction. Wickham visited again in September and called Magnus insane. He said the cabin looked like a wood pile with a roof, that no sensible man would waste such effort, that Magnus had proven himself unfit for mountain life. Magnus was mortaring another section of cordwood into place and did not look up from his work. The construction process Magnus had developed required patience that bordered on meditation. Each wall section demanded multiple steps performed in precise sequence. He would lay a bed of his clay mixture approximately 1 inch thick along the previous course. Then he would set cordwood pieces into the mortar, spacing them with careful attention to create consistent gaps. The gaps were critical. Too wide and the insulating mixture would slump. Too narrow and the thermal mass effect would be compromised. Between each piece of cordwood, Magnus packed his insulating fill. He had experimented with ratios throughout the summer and settled on a mixture that was 60% sawdust, 30% clay, and 10% dried moss. The sawdust provided insulation and prevented the clay from cracking as it dried. The moss added flexibility and helped the mixture adhere to the wood. He mixed batches in his iron pot, adding water until the consistency felt right, then applying it with a flat wooden paddle he had carved for the purpose. The walls rose slowly. Magnus completed approximately 18 inches of height per week, working from dawn until dark. Each course had to dry partially before he could add the next, preventing the weight from compressing the lower sections. He built simple scaffolding from poles as the walls grew higher, allowing him to work comfortably at any height. By October, the walls had reached 6 feet, the height he had planned for the structure. Corner integration presented the most complex challenge. He could not simply stack cordwood at 90-degree angles and expect structural stability. Instead, he built the corners using his original method of horizontal logs, creating solid posts at each corner that extended from foundation to roof. The cordwood sections then butted against these corner posts, tied into the structure with wooden pegs driven through the logs and into the cordwood ends. The result was a hybrid system that combined traditional log construction for structural support with cordwood masonry for thermal performance. The top course of each wall received special attention. Magnus created a level surface by carefully selecting cordwood pieces of identical length and setting them in a thicker bed of mortar. This top course would support the roof beams and had to be perfectly level across all 4 walls. He used his brass level constantly, adjusting pieces until the measurements satisfied him. Window and door openings required their own solutions. Magnus framed each opening with vertical and horizontal timbers, creating boxes within the wall structure. He then built the cordwood sections up to these frames, mortaring the wood ends directly against the framing timbers. The frames provided structural support and created mounting surfaces for the door and window shutters he would install later. By November, the walls were complete. The structure looked unlike any cabin in the territory. From outside, it appeared to be constructed entirely of stacked firewood, the cut ends creating a textured surface that caught light and shadow. Thomas Wickham rode past one afternoon, stared for several minutes, shook his head in apparent disgust, and continued on without speaking. Magnus had no formal training in thermodynamics, but he understood heat through observation and practical testing. He had spent September conducting experiments while his walls dried between courses. He built small test sections of wall using different configurations and measured their performance by building fires on one side and monitoring temperature differences across the wall thickness. A standard log cabin wall was approximately 8 inches thick, consisting of a single log laid horizontally. When Magnus built a fire against a test section of traditional log wall, he could feel warmth on the opposite side within minutes. The wood conducted heat efficiently from the fire side to the exterior, which meant it also conducted cold efficiently from outside to inside. This was the fundamental problem he was trying to solve. His cordwood wall was 16 inches thick, double the width of traditional construction, but thickness alone did not explain its superior performance. The secret lay in the wall's composition. Each cordwood piece was 10 inches long when green, drying to approximately 9.5 inches. The remaining space in the 16-inch wall was filled with his insulating mixture. This created a wall that was effectively 3 layers, 4 3/4 inches of wood, 6.5 inches of insulating fill, and another 4 3/4 inches of wood. Magnus tested sections of this configuration and found that heat moved through it dramatically slower than through solid log walls. More importantly, the wood itself absorbed heat and released it gradually over hours. During his tests, he would heat one side of a cordwood section for 2 hours, then Remove the heat source. The opposite side would continue growing warmer for another hour as the wood mass slowly conducted the absorbed heat through its structure. This thermal lag meant the wall would continue radiating heat into the cabin long after the fire had died down. He also discovered that his insulating mixture performed better than he had initially expected. The combination of sawdust, clay, and moss created tiny air pockets throughout the material. Air was an excellent insulator when trapped in small spaces. The clay prevented air movement, while the sawdust created the pocket structure. The result was a material that conducted heat even more slowly than wood. The roof presented different challenges. Magnus built it with a steep pitch to shed snow and used traditional pole construction covered with bark and sod. But he added an innovation derived from his thermal mass principles. Below the roof poles, he installed a ceiling made of split planks laid tightly together. Above these planks, he packed 6 inches of his sawdust mixture, creating an insulated attic space. Heat rising from the cabin's interior would be trapped by this insulating layer rather than escaping directly through the roof. The chimney required careful design. Magnus built it from flat stones mortared with clay, ensuring a tight seal that would not leak smoke into the living space. He made the flue narrow to increase draft efficiency and included a damper that would allow him to control airflow. Every detail served the single purpose of keeping heat inside the structure. The first snow fell on November 18, 1841. Magnus had completed his cabin 3 days earlier and moved his supplies inside. The interior was sparse but functional. A sleeping platform built against one wall raised 2 feet off the ground. Shelves for food stores and equipment, a small table and single chair. The stone fireplace occupied the northwest corner, its chimney rising through the insulated roof space he had constructed. Magnus lit his first fire on the evening of November 20th when the temperature dropped below freezing. He used dry pine kindling and gradually added larger pieces of split wood. The fire caught easily and began radiating heat into the small space. Within an hour, Magnus noticed the first significant difference from his previous cabin. The walls were not developing frost patterns. The interior surfaces remained dry and relatively warm to the touch. By midnight, with outside temperature at 15 degrees above zero, the cabin's interior had reached approximately 55 degrees. Magnus was sitting comfortably in his shirt sleeves, something that would have been impossible in his old cabin. He let the fire burn down to coals and went to sleep. When he woke 6 hours later, the fire had died completely. The interior temperature had dropped, but only to about 45 degrees. The walls had absorbed so much heat during the evening that they were still radiating warmth into the space. December brought serious cold. Temperatures regularly dropped below zero at night. Magnus established a routine of burning moderate fires morning and evening, allowing them to die between sessions. He discovered that his cabin required approximately 1/3 the firewood his previous structure had consumed. The wood he did burn heated the walls themselves as much as the air, and those walls continued releasing heat for hours after the fire died. Other trappers began noticing the reduced smoke from Magnus's chimney. Wickham's cabin, 8 miles south, produced a constant plume of smoke throughout winter. Magnus's chimney smoked heavily for a few hours twice daily, then went nearly dormant. Wickham mentioned this during a brief encounter in January, suggesting that Magnus must be freezing in his strange woodpile cabin. Magnus invited him inside for coffee. Wickham stepped through the door, stopped immediately, and stared around the interior in obvious confusion. It was warm, not merely tolerable, but genuinely comfortable. The walls radiated heat perceptibly. No frost patterns decorated the interior surfaces. Wickham removed his heavy coat within minutes and sat at Magnus's table drinking coffee in silence. He asked no questions about the construction method. He made no comments about his previous mockery. He finished his coffee, put his coat back on, and left without speaking beyond basic pleasantries. Word spread slowly through the isolated trapping camps. Magnus's cabin stayed warm with minimal fire. The strange construction method apparently worked. A few trappers stopped by to examine the cordwood walls, but most dismissed it as too much effort for marginal improvement. They continued burning massive amounts of firewood and sleeping in their furs, accepting cold as inevitable. January 18, 1843. A cold front descended from Canada with unprecedented severity. Temperatures plummeted to 55 degrees below zero, the coldest weather Magnus had experienced in his 12 years in the mountains. The air itself seemed to crystallize. Trees cracked with sounds like rifle shots as sap froze and expanded. Wildlife disappeared into burrows and dens. The few trappers scattered across the region retreated to their cabins and burned every piece of wood they could spare. Jacob Reinhardt lived 14 miles northeast of Magnus's camp. Reinhardt was a German immigrant who had arrived in the mountains 3 years earlier. He was competent, hard-working, and had built his cabin using the same traditional methods every other trapper employed. When the extreme cold hit, Reinhardt burned wood constantly. He fed his fireplace every hour through the day and night, maintaining flames that consumed his carefully gathered woodpile at an alarming rate. The cabin's interior never rose above freezing. By the second night of the cold snap, Reinhardt was burning furniture. He broke apart his table and chairs, splitting them into pieces small enough to feed his fire. His hands were numb despite heavy gloves. His feet had lost feeling hours earlier. Frost covered every interior surface of his cabin, including the ceiling directly above the fireplace. His breath crystallized instantly in the air. He knew he was in serious danger, but had no solution beyond burning more wood. On the morning of the third day, Reinhardt's woodpile was exhausted. He had burned everything combustible except the structural logs of his cabin walls. The fire died to coals, then to ash. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature matched the exterior. Reinhardt wrapped himself in every fur and blanket he owned and made a desperate decision. He would travel to Magnus's cabin and ask for help. The journey would take approximately 4 hours in good conditions. In this cold, it might kill him. He arrived at Magnus's camp near midday, stumbling and barely coherent from cold exposure. Magnus heard him calling and opened the door immediately. Reinhardt fell through the entrance and collapsed on the floor. Magnus pulled him inside, closed the door, and began the careful process of warming a severely hypothermic man. He did not put Reinhardt near the fire, knowing that rapid warming could be fatal. Instead, he wrapped him in blankets and let the cabin's ambient warmth gradually restore his core temperature. Reinhardt regained consciousness after 2 hours. The first thing he noticed was the temperature. Magnus's cabin was comfortable despite only a moderate fire burning in the fireplace. The walls radiated perceptible heat. No frost patterns marred the interior surfaces. Reinhardt sat up slowly and looked around with the expression of a man seeing something that contradicted everything he thought he understood. Magnus explained nothing initially. He gave Reinhardt hot coffee and food, let him recover fully, and provided a place to sleep. The next morning, when Reinhardt was strong enough to listen, Magnus described his cordwood wall system in detail. Jacob Reinhardt stayed at Magnus's cabin for 6 days while the extreme cold persisted. During that time, he studied every aspect of the cordwood construction. He examined the walls inside and outside, measured the thickness with a folding rule he carried, asked detailed questions about the insulating mixture and the stacking technique. Magnus answered every question freely. He had never intended to keep the method secret. If others could benefit from what he had learned, that served the basic purpose of survival that all trappers shared. When the temperature moderated, Reinhardt returned to his own camp. He spent the remainder of that winter rebuilding his cabin using Magnus's cordwood method. The work was difficult in cold weather, but Reinhardt was motivated by visceral memory of near death from freezing. By March, he had completed 2 walls. By May, the entire structure was finished. The following winter, Reinhardt burned less. then half the firewood he had previously required, and remained comfortable throughout even the coldest periods. Other trappers heard about Reinhardt's experience through the informal communication network that connected isolated camps. A few visited Magnus's cabin to see the construction firsthand. Some adopted the technique immediately. Others modified their existing cabins by adding cordwood exterior walls over the original log construction, creating a hybrid that improved thermal performance without requiring complete rebuilding. A trapper named William Davies built a cordwood cabin in the Wind River Range during the summer of 1844. Two brothers, surnames unknown, constructed matching cordwood structures near the headwaters of the Gallatin River in 1845. The technique spread without attribution. No one called them Holt cabins or credited Magnus with the innovation. Trappers simply described them as cordwood construction or stacked wood walls. Magnus heard second-hand reports of his method being used in locations he had never visited, adapted by men he had never met. He felt no resentment about the lack of recognition. The point had never been fame or credit. The point had been solving a problem that killed people. Thomas Wickham built a cordwood cabin in 1846, 7 years after mocking Magnus for wasting time on foolish construction experiments. Wickham never acknowledged that he had been wrong or that Magnus had been right. He simply arrived at Magnus's camp one spring morning, examined the walls for 2 hours without speaking, then left. The following winter, travelers reported seeing a new cabin at Wickham's location with distinctive stacked wood walls. By 1848, cordwood construction had become one of several accepted methods for building winter shelter in the northern Rockies. It was not universal. Many trappers continued using traditional log construction, either from habit or because they lacked the patience for the labor-intensive cordwood method. But for those who prioritized warmth and fuel efficiency over construction speed, cordwood had proven itself through the most rigorous testing possible: survival through multiple severe winters. Magnus's innovation had become part of the collective knowledge that helped people endure one of the harshest environments on the continent. The Rocky Mountain fur trade collapsed in the early 1850s. Beaver populations had been trapped nearly to extinction in accessible watersheds. More significantly, European fashion had shifted away from beaver felt hats toward silk alternatives. The economic foundation that had supported hundreds of trappers across the West simply disappeared. Men who had spent decades in the mountains faced a choice: find new livelihoods in the wilderness or return to civilization. Magnus left the mountains in 1852 at age 43. He had saved money carefully during his trapping years and used it to purchase land in Oregon's Willamette Valley. He built a small farmhouse, married a widow named Catherine Lundgren in 1854, and spent the remaining 17 years of his life farming wheat and raising Catherine's 2 children from her previous marriage. He never returned to the mountains. He rarely spoke about his trapping years. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a quiet Norwegian farmer with calloused hands and a preference for solitude. The cordwood cabins remained. Settlers moving west along emigrant trails discovered abandoned structures in remote valleys and along mountain streams. Some were still occupied by aging trappers who had refused to leave. Others stood empty, their doors hanging open, their interiors colonized by mice and pack rats. But even the abandoned cabins demonstrated remarkable durability. The cordwood walls resisted decay far better than traditional log construction. The insulating mixture remained largely intact. Some structures built in the 1840s were still serviceable in the 1860s. Homesteaders recognized quality construction when they saw it. Several families moving into Montana and Wyoming territories claimed abandoned cordwood cabins and repaired them for permanent occupation. Others studied the construction method and built new structures using the same principles. Army engineers surveying routes for roads and telegraph lines noted cordwood construction in their reports, describing it as a regional adaptation well suited to extreme cold climates. The technique continued evolving. Builders experimented with different cordwood lengths, various insulating materials, and alternative wall configurations. Some used lime mortar instead of clay mixture. Others incorporated stone foundations and more sophisticated roof systems. The basic principle remained constant: walls built from short sections of wood stacked perpendicular to the wall plane with insulating material filling the gaps provided superior thermal performance compared to traditional horizontal log construction. Magnus Holt died on March 4, 1869, from pneumonia. He was 60 years old. Catherine buried him in a small cemetery outside Salem, Oregon, under a simple granite marker that listed his name, birth year, and death year. The stone made no mention of his time in the mountains or the construction method he had developed. His stepchildren inherited the farm and knew almost nothing about their stepfather's previous life. But in the mountains of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho, cordwood cabins still stood. Some sheltered families. Others served as way stations for hunters and travelers. A few remained empty but intact, their thick walls keeping interiors dry and protected from the elements. They were silent monuments to a man who had solved a problem through observation, experimentation, and relentless attention to detail.